Welcome, everyone. My name is Margaret Rawls. I work at the Washington National Cathedral. We're so glad you're joining us for our discussion this evening on Mike Austin's God and Guns in America. If you're just seeing a screen and hearing my voice, you're in the right place. We'll bring our guest up in just a few moments. In the meantime, we wanted to provide some information about this evening's event. If you have a technical question you can't hear or see, please ask for help using the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. To see the icons, just hover over the bottom of your Zoom window. You'll see one that's labeled chat. It looks like a speech bubble. The other feature we'll be using this evening is the Q&A function, also located on that icon bar. Throughout the program, even starting now, drop questions you have for our panelists there. Throughout the second half of the program, we'll answer some of them. You can also like and upvote questions there. So if there's a question from an attendee that you want to have answered, feel free to like or comment on it. Again, use that Q&A function to drop any questions you have for their author, or the chat function for any problems you have. Thanks all.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Randy Hollerith. I'm the Dean of the Cathedral, Washington National Cathedral, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation. We're so pleased to have Michael Austin with us to discuss his book, God and Guns in America. It's an important work, and it raises lots of fascinating questions, which I know will lead to some really great conversation. I'm also thrilled to be joined tonight with Rob Schenck, who is the president of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute and a wonderful colleague, and another colleague that I get to work with every day at the Cathedral, the Reverend Dr. Leonard Hamlin, who is our Canon for mission at the Cathedral. So I'd like to start us tonight with a brief prayer, and then I'm going to read you a little bit of bio about Michael Austin. And then we'll allow Mike to do a little bit of sort of solo presentation or discussion about his book. He has a little bit to share. And then we'll come back in and have some conversation. Mike and I will. And then we'll bring in Rob and Leonard and have some more conversation. And then we'll take questions and answers. And I know what's going to happen is that this hour is going to absolutely fly by before we've even blinked. So send your questions in, and thank you for being with us, and we'll do the best we can to get to them, because I know there's so much to discuss. So if you are a person of faith and would like to bow your head with me for a prayer, I'd like to share with you the prayer of St. Francis, which is one of my very favorites, and I think quite appropriate for the times in which we live. So let us pray. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. So let me tell you all a little bit about our author tonight, Michael Austin, if you don't know him. He is a professor of philosophy at Eastern Kentucky University and a senior fellow at the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute. He's published numerous books, including Humility and Human Flourishing and Being Good, Christian Values for Everyday Life. He hosts a podcast entitled Flourish that focuses on developing character and cultures of character. His teaching, writing, and speaking focus on questions related to character and human flourishing, and is grounded in the conviction that philosophy has much to offer us in our individual, social, and spiritual lives. Michael, welcome. We're so glad to have you with us. And Leonard, Rob, and I will disappear for a few minutes and let you have the floor. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So I thought what I'd do, rather than try to give an overview of the whole book, with just a few of the main ideas, and then we'll see where the discussion goes. But I think maybe the best way is, in a sentence, the main idea of the book is that we can reduce gun violence in America, and that while doing that, we can still protect the rights of responsible gun owners. And Christians especially have good reasons grounded in their faith to do just that. Right? We value life. We want to bring peace into the world. So some of the stuff early in the book, I focus on kind of the background of gun culture and how we got to where we are in the United States, and different ideas from history, how that happened. And some of it is the story many are familiar with in terms of the Revolutionary War and the 1800s. But capitalism is a big part of that story as well in the 1900s. And so that I trace some of that development. Second Amendment, I think, is something else. Of course, there's a lot of controversy about. What I do is just lay out the main ideas that people have had about it. But one thing that I think is really vital to know in terms of the Second Amendment is that it wasn't until the 2008 Heller decision that the Supreme Court explicitly found that the Second Amendment protected the individual right to own a firearm. So there's back and forth about that over the years, but that's important to know. What's really important to know about that, and I thought I'd read this line from the Heller decision. They said this, that nothing in our opinion should be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places like schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. So the legal debate right now, I mean, it's settled in terms of the Supreme Court found there is an individual right. I'm more interested as an ethicist in whether there's a moral right to bear arms, whether there's a moral foundation for the right. And now argue that there is, but that it's not an absolute right, right? There are conditions. So I think you can probably generate a good moral right to bear arms having to do with the right to self-defense and the obligation to protect other people. And that given in our society, sometimes a firearm is needed to exercise that right or fulfill that obligation. You've got a good initial argument for the right to bear arms. But of course, like any other right, it's limited. And just like our rights to freedom of speech are limited by harm to others, right? I can't yell fire in a crowded theater or incite a riot, those kind of things, because of the potential harm that could happen to other people. So freedom of speech is not absolute. The right to bear arms is not absolute. So just like responsible gun owners have a right to bear arms, other people have a right to safety and bodily security. So moviegoers, churchgoers, students, right? Those kind of things, people at a concert. So we want to make sure that whatever we do, we're trying to set the stage where everybody's rights are protected to the maximum level that we can. And look, that goes along with, I think, this idea that we all have intuitively, but that it's a good one, that with rights come responsibilities. And if you can't fulfill those responsibilities, then in general, you don't get to exercise the right. So that's sort of the foundation. And what I go on from there to do, I think one thing I'll talk about some in the book, I talk about here a little bit, there are just a lot of sort of slogans or cliches really on both sides, so people maybe say a sentence or two like that settles the argument, like guns don't kill people, people kill people, or violence never solved anything, or guns protect us from tyranny. And maybe that's one of the ones I'll talk about now. And if we want to discuss others, we can later. But many people point to the Second Amendment and just their own sort of moral perspective as the right to bear arms helps us keep the government in check. And to be honest, I'm skeptical of that for a few reasons. First of all, I have faith in the US military that if a tyrannical executive branch, for example, at some point in the future, tried to exercise tyranny in the United States, I think that we could rely on our military leadership to fulfill their oaths to the Constitution, right? Because that's the oath they take, not to particular president or federal government. Probably even more in the practical realm, given the weaponry that the United States military and the government has, it doesn't, me having even an AR-15, which I don't, but if I did, it's not going to do much, right? Given the drone capabilities, weapons of mass destruction. If you really want to kind of match the government weapon for weapon, you're led to the position that it's okay for citizens to have WMDs. For me, that's an absurd conclusion, and so we can reject it. So anyway, we talk about that some. What else do I want to cover here? I think that more importantly, for anyone from just a general moral perspective, and particularly a Christian one as well, if we're concerned about tyranny or injustice in our government, then what we need to do, rather than try to arm ourselves to the gills, is strengthen the institutions of society, the checks and balances of the government, strengthen the rule of law, work hard to foster a society where everybody's basic rights are secured. That's the better way, right? It's the nonviolent way. Another question, another issue I discuss a lot in the book, I wish I'd done it more looking back on it, is there is an interesting connection between gun use and character, like our virtues and vices. Of course, that's something, as you mentioned, I'm interested in as a philosopher. This isn't all gun owners or even all gun culture in America, but there is a segment of gun culture in America that some scholars call gun culture 2.0, where the reason for owning a gun is to be like a citizen protector, right? Part of being a good citizen is being armed. And so some people in that movement refer to themselves as the sheepdogs, and then people who are unarmed are the sheep who are sort of at the mercy of the wolves who are the bad guys. And so I think that there's good psychological evidence from this, from studies in terms of some military training by the military themselves, that show some of these kind of practices and ways of thinking about other people can dehumanize them. And obviously when we dehumanize somebody else, even just in our minds, it undermines empathy. And empathy is really a part of our human psychology that helps us really, it creates helping behavior, right? It leads us to help other people in need, prevents moral vices like callousness, hatred, things like that. And so I'm concerned that some people jump into that aspect of American gun culture, and it actually has a negative impact on their character. The last part of the book, I offer several different solutions. And I think it's really important to see that there's no one size fits all. There's not going to be a magic law or a magic social program that on its own is going to eradicate gun violence. In fact, I'm not even sure we can completely eradicate it, at least in the near term. I think the goal should be to reduce it and reduce it significantly. And I think that there are things we can do that can help us reach that goal. So we have to think of it as a piecemeal approach. So red flag laws are what are more formally known as extreme risk protection orders. I'm in favor of those. I think universal background checks, we should close that loophole. I think at a moral and spiritual level, I think fostering communities where some of the root issues of gun violence begin to be addressed. And it is true that no law can eliminate all gun violence, but we have laws because they can have an impact that can reduce the kind of behavior that we want to see reduced. And so I think there is a place for the law. I think there's a place for people of goodwill, people of different faiths to come together and work and create communities that flourish. And when we do that, fewer people will feel the need to turn to gun violence. So that's a quick overview. I think at the fundamental level, I think this is more the Christian perspective. I want us to take a perspective of being peace builders. That should be our guiding image as followers of the Christian faith, because ultimately our main moral imperative is to love God and love our neighbors and do all we can to create a culture where every single human life, every single one, from the worst criminal to the highest paragon of virtue, we value each of those human beings because they're made in God's image, because they have inherent dignity and worth. And I think if we come at it from that direction, we can reduce gun violence and save people's lives in the short and long term. So that's kind of the quick overview.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for that. That was very helpful, I know, to a lot of folks. And it certainly opens up lots of questions and places for conversation. But just real quickly, just to start, how did you come to the place of wanting to write this book?
Yeah, it's interesting because I never really, it wasn't premeditated. Sometimes I sit, like the book on Christian virtue, I sort of sat and thought about that book and thought we need to do this. I think I first came across some arguments on the internet, and they were bad, big surprise, from, both extremes, where I thought the arguments didn't work. And then I came across people who held their view so strongly, but the reasons they gave for them didn't really do the work that they thought it did. And so I thought, well, I want to look at these in more detail, in more depth for myself. I had some thoughts and beliefs on the issues already, but I thought I want to look at some of the strongest arguments and try to figure out where I stand, and then try to incorporate that from a Christian perspective in this book in particular. And so, yeah, I sort of fell into it in some ways. And then once I got into it, did some online writing and online debate, and there was some interest in the book. So I jumped in and did it because there really was nothing like it. A lot of even Christian sort of ethics texts that you might see at like a Christian university or a seminary, they didn't deal with gun violence at all, or they only did it in a really cursory way. And so it's sort of that classic, there's really nothing like this, and I thought it could be helpful.
Thank you. It certainly is helpful. Just to be upfront, I am a gun owner myself and have been for most of my life. I grew up in a family where I spent a significant amount of time growing up hunting with at least 2 generations of my family, bird hunting, and still enjoy that to this day with friends. I don't hunt anything that I don't eat. That's a basic rule for me. But interestingly enough, I can remember as a child, as a young person growing up, you talk some about this in your book, getting a gun was a rite of passage of sorts. And and I would agree with that it's a rite of passage of sorts, but I'm interested in your take on this. For me, growing up as a child with my grandfather and my brother and my father out in the fields hunting, when you're a boy, when you're young, you don't carry anything. When you're 10 or 11, you might have a BB gun with nothing in it. And then when you're 13, 14, 15, you might be able to move up to a shotgun that's unloaded. And then at some point, the family decides that you're safe enough, you've learned enough of the safety rules, and you're mature enough and respectful enough that they give you permission to carry a shotgun when you hunt. And for me, I remember that process. It wasn't so much about getting the gun that was so exciting. It was this sense that I had become a trusted member of my family, that I had grown up some, right?
Right.
So talk a little bit about sort of that Americana notion of guns and so deeply ingrained in our culture.
Yeah, it's interesting because I grew up outside of Kansas City in Kansas. So my dad also into shotgun sports. We hunted pheasant and quail, waterfowl growing up, but similar thing. So it had to reach a certain age before I could actually carry a loaded gun and do it, pass a hunter safety test. So the kind of gun culture I grew up in we were kind of in the outskirts of the city. It was more that rural hunting, and yeah, you don't shoot what you're not going to eat. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're not going to touch a gun. So those were big values. And it wasn't a rite of passage for me, as I say I think in the introduction of the book. I owned a 22 rifle before I was born. My dad bought one at an old TG&Y for $4 when my mom was pregnant with me. But yeah, you see this, and this is part of tracing the history in the U.S. because there were some issues like during periods of time, the major gun manufacturers at times would be struggling to actually be profitable and stay above, keep their heads above water financially. And you start looking in the 1900s, there are a lot of different advertisements about, every parent wants their son to be a dead-eye marksman, right? And so this give your son a gun when a boy becomes a man, sometime in the teenage years, I think 12, 13, something like that. So yeah, it's interesting that that's a part of it. But I think some of it is cultural. So guns get passed down from father to son. I'm not from Kentucky, but I live here. And I mentioned this the other day when I was discussing with somebody. was at a barber shop, and one of the barbers in the place just pulled a small little handgun out of his front pocket. And now 10 years ago, when I was in California, that would have been weird, but in Kentucky, it was no big deal. Well, he was talking about how that was passed down from his dad to him. It was a family heirloom. And so that's part of, I think it's easy to dismiss recreational gun use if it's not a part of your life. And I want to make space for that. But again, it's just like I said in my little overview, with rights come responsibilities. And that's a big part of recreational gun use ethics, I think, that you need to keep in mind.
With the guys, men and women, but the people that I'm engaged with, bird hunting or shooting clay targets or whatever, every single one of them completely agrees that there are common sense laws and guidelines that ought to happen around gun ownership that make perfect sense. And I have to say that there's no one among my friends who really sees an AR-15 in any way beneficial for anything, right? And target shooting, I guess, but it's not a hunting weapon or anything else. But so they understand that there ought to be laws and guidelines, just the way there are laws and guidelines about getting a license to drive a car or anything else. Why is it for so many folks, though, that the idea of passing any law or any change will create a domino effect that will bring about the collapse of the Second Amendment right?
Yeah, I think in some ways in my book, maybe I was a little too easy on the NRA, because I think part of it comes from the rhetoric that's come from there. I think a lot of people believe, they're worried that it's a slippery slope, right? If you just give any restrictions, then ultimately they just want to take our guns away, right? So we've heard that off and on for years, has never happened. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it is which we've seen in recent years too, a growing distrust of the government. It's sort of this strange mix of patriotism, yet also a distrust of the federal government. And so I think a lot of things come into play there. The majority of people, even NRA members, the most recent surveys I've seen, agree with some of these, what we would call common sense, reasonable gun laws. But for some reason, the people making the most noise are the ones that are saying, no, you can't let any restrictions. But of course, there are already restrictions, right? So it's a bit of a red herring for me.
So we'll talk a little bit about the intertwining of the gun culture with certain expressions of the Christian faith in the United States.
Yeah, that's something honestly I struggle with, because even though, as I mentioned, I grew up in sort of gun culture 1.0, the hunting, recreational, it was never something that in our family or in our practice was like deeply connected with our religious practices or our faith. And so I struggle, but I think in the book I mentioned this. I think it goes back to something that I just said. I think they're passed down. It's seen as like a part of our family. Like our family are hunters, or our family own guns, right? And so we practice shooting sports. So somehow that aspect of family life gets intertwined with, another part of what our family does is, we believe in God, or we attend church, or we're devoted to our faith. I talked to a colleague last spring, well, not last spring, it must have been in the fall when we were actually on campus, and she heard about the book and said, yeah, God and guns, that's what my family believes in. So I think, and I don't understand the connection in terms of my own conception of those things, but I think that's it. I think for a lot of people, patriotism, family identity, and religion, they all sort of get intertwined. In its worst case scenarios, it becomes a Christian nationalism. In its less pernicious forms, it's more just a kind of, these are the core values of our family or our community.
Yeah, it's almost it's part of the American mythology, right? Self-reliance.
That's right.
Apple pie, patriotism, your faith, your country, deeply connected, those two, and guns become a piece of that. I can see that. To help to clarify for people, let's go a little bit more to the philosophical, ethical background of the piece of it. I got so many questions I want to ask you. I can go on forever, but let's just do this. Talk for people's sake. You mentioned this in your opening, but talk a little bit about the difference between a legal right and a moral right. Because I think that's a fascinating distinction that a lot of folks don't understand.
Yeah, it's really important because, so let's think of an example. A legal right is any right that's recognized or codified in a system of laws. So right now in the United States of America, women, 18 and above have the legal right to vote. Prior to women's suffrage, they didn't have the legal right to vote. But we would argue that was obviously wrong, that even before they had the legal right, they had the moral right to vote, right? Morally speaking, there are ethical arguments you can give that women deserve to have that right to vote. And then once it became recognized by the law, that moral right also became a legal right. So that distinction is important because ultimately we want our legal rights to be grounded in our moral rights, and we want our moral rights to be recognized appropriately by the laws of our society. So that's an important difference.
And so how does that distinction tie in with the gun issue? That's a really hard question to answer.
Yeah, well, it's important because, and maybe in some ways this goes back to even the Christian moral view that I articulate in the book, that if somebody just appeals to the Second Amendment as settling the issue, well, in a certain sense, sure, it settles the legal issue given the current interpretations. I mean, the lawyers and legal scholars can continue to debate that, of course. But at a deeper level, we want to know, well, what's the moral issue, right? Is there a right that's grounded in, that's generated by the fact that I'm a human being that gives me a right to bear arms or a right to vote or a right to determine my own, course of my life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So in my view, the whole American experiment, so to speak, was these are moral rights that human beings have been given by God, or we have because of our basic dignity. You don't want sort of the religious background, but just the more general one. And then we want to have a set of laws that recognizes those rights so people can flourish.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
That's right. Yeah.
So how much time do we have left here? Well, I'll do a couple more questions. I got like 15 here. So so let's just jump to it. What do you talk about? You want to focus on being a peace builder. Mm-hmm. That you think that's one of the solutions, one of the ways of moving forward, because really one of the deepest questions is how do we move out of this morass, right? I mean, right. There's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, on both sides. I think there are a lot of gun owners who think that people who want more restrictions on guns just want to get rid of all of them. And there are a lot of folks who don't, who morally disagree with gun ownership, who think that all gun owners, somehow are fanatical about it, which is, just unfair. So you talk about being a peace builder. What does that mean?
Yeah, so in one sense, it means trying to find common ground, and there may not be common ground, but I think we can bring people at those extremes to find some common ground if we just come into conversation and actually interact and have dialogue. But from a theological and moral perspective, it also has to do with different views of violence in the history of and contemporary sort of Christian, different denominations, Christian faith, generally speaking. And so you've got the two big traditions would be the just war tradition on one side that not only applies to, war between nations, but people have applied it also to interpersonal situations. So for example, if like just war theory says a nation is morally justified in going to war if they're attacked by another nation, right, as a war of self-defense, and then people have applied that to, the individual lives. If I'm attacked, I have a right to defend my own life. On the other extreme would be, or the other end would be like someone who's a pacifist and who thinks maybe they're like a really thoroughgoing pacifist, that all violence is wrong. It's always immoral, right? And so they might ground that in different passages of scripture, the Sermon on the Mount, other sort of just pacifist thought that people have given over the years. And the position I lay out, I call it peace building because I think there are cases, and they're tragic, but I think there are cases where violence is justified. I just think it's a lot fewer than we tend to think in practice. The whole point of just war theory was supposed to be a restraint or a check on the impulse to go to war, to use violence. But human nature, as it is, we sort of use it often to justify it after the fact. I did move closer to the pacifist view over the course of my research and reading and thought in the book. I'm not all the way there yet because I think what really keeps me going all the way there is love of neighbor, that sometimes loving my neighbor means I've got to protect my vulnerable neighbor from violence from somebody else. I but that should be the exception. So the peace builder, here's the key difference. But the peace builder admits he's not a pacifist, or she's not a pacifist, because she thinks violence is sometimes justified. But she's closer to pacifism than just war theory, because the peace builder doesn't just say, is violence justified here? And if the answer is yes, then uses it. But they ask that second, deeper question: even if violence is justified, is there some nonviolent option I can use right now? And especially from a Christian faith perspective, we've got a lot of, both in history and in our scriptures, people who gave their lives for others. So we've got to be willing to lay our life down non-violently at some times as well. So that's the idea.
It's fascinating. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's bring Rob and Leonard in, and let's expand the conversation a little bit. We'll see how they'll pop up here in a second. Gentlemen, glad to have you with us. Jump right in.
Thank you, Dean Hollerith, and thank you, Leonard Hamlin, and especially Mike Austin. That was just outstanding. I think one of the reasons I was so excited about your book, Mike, is, of course, it's a subject that I've dealt with extensively, and particularly in a Christian frame of reference, which you give it in your book. It's not exclusive. A lot of what you present is universal, would apply to anyone with a faith or without faith. But I'm particularly interested in the Christian framework, and I have a particular question for you, and that is, are gun owners always, and I'm talking about people who have firearms for defensive purposes for themselves and to defend others, are gun owners always entitled to a presumption of good and responsible behavior? Because I hear this argument quite a bit. I'm a legal gun owner, don't imply that I'm irresponsible. We are responsible people. We are legal and responsible gun owners. But when an individual is a stranger, we don't know that person. So because someone bears a weapon, carries into a grocery store, for example, or more and more into a church, are we obligated to presume that they are responsible and moral people in their intended use of the firearm?
Yeah, I wish I could say yes, because I know plenty of gun owners who are responsible people. But one of the most heartbreaking things about doing this book is reading accounts of innocent people being shot, of fathers shooting their own children for mistaking them for, a home invader or somebody at night who was prowling around. There's stories of a grandfather in Kentucky had his handgun, he was cleaning it, he set it on the end table, went to the next room, and the 4-year-old picked it up and killed his 2-year-old sibling. So this is where it gets difficult, because I think people immediately feel defensive. Like you said, they'll feel defensive. But the facts on the ground, so to speak, mean I'm not going to initially think that, because in my state, there's basically, you can have a concealed carry license. You don't even have to take the short little class. It's a sort of an automatic presumptive right. And so if we lived in a society like, and one of the things I would like that I talk about in the book, we should have some sort of either federal or state by state mandatory gun safety and competency courses that somebody has to pass along the lines of driving an automobile. Then I'd be much more apt to have that sort of initial presumption of responsibility. But given the prevalence of guns in our country, the ages and the kinds of people that have them, that have no training, by the kinds of people, I mean people that have no training. We see that in COVID-19. There are more gun checks went through that FBI system in March than ever since the system went into place. And those are a lot of first-time gun owners, and a lot of them probably got no training. They don't know what they're doing, and that's dangerous for them. And if they're carrying them out in public, for anybody that's around them. So yeah, that's something that I am concerned about. It's a good question.
Well, thank you. And full disclosure, thank you for the honor of having written the preface to your book. It was one of the most important tasks I've undertaken because I think your book is so necessary and timely. So thank you.
Well, and part of when Dean Hollerith mentioned this, the Armor of Light, the documentary, your own story, seeing what some of the people that, the more conservative evangelicals and some of the things they said also spurred me to look into this because I just was deeply morally and spiritually concerned. I think there's a place where you talk about in there that you wouldn't trust yourself on, and you're amazed how easily they trust themselves. That's something that I want to get in the book, that this is an incredibly serious decision, shouldn't be made flippantly. We've got to really think through who we are and what kind of power we're giving ourselves if we do that.
You know, Mike, I'm grateful for this discussion. I'm thankful for our dean allowing the space for this to take place, and Rob, your being here. We have so many persons that are interested in this conversation, and having it certainly helps us to move forward or to begin to come to certain understandings and awareness. We have, a gun violence prevention group here at the Cathedral that was advocating for this particular session to take place, as well as others that we're working with around the region. And when we talk about persons of faith, and I'm grateful, Rob, as you were pointing right there, as we talk about persons of faith as well as other communities and assemblies of faith, we're always struggling with where we find common ground at times. And that can be whether it is in the rural or urban environment. I'm one that didn't grow up, of course. I grew up in the city, so I see the perspective completely different. But we always get to a place where people talk or ask the question, how do you see the role, or what is the role of a person of faith in this whole debate? What should they be doing? Or what should churches, synagogues, or however we might classify that? That's the main question that many are saying. How would you address that?
Yeah. I mean, I think churches have to start taking on this issue publicly. I think it can be seen as in many parts of the country, many churches, as I'm not going to touch that issue from the pulpit or take a stand on that in our church because they're worried about all the backlash and all the politics and all the stuff that goes into it. But I think churches should actually be engaging in discussions, looking at the scriptures, looking at their faith tradition, those kind of things, and trying to bring those things to bear upon this issue, looking at it from that perspective. Of course, that's what I try to do in the book, but there are a lot of places in the book where you can go much deeper, have good discussion. So one, I think, let's just actually talk about this in our churches with each other in a respectful, loving way, and figure out if we can make some progress, find common ground, and do something in, not just in terms of making a statement on our website or a political statement, but in our particular communities. How is gun violence affecting this community that we're in, that we minister in and among? What can we do? So it might, in some places, it might be providing access to, look, there's economic injustices, there's all kind of social injustices, things that can lead people to turn to gun violence. People do it out of fear, like they are in the pandemic. And some people they're just afraid to discuss it. So that's what I'd like to see. The church can be the church. It can love people. It can serve the community. It can create programs, relationships, help people flourish, help them deal with the problems they have, the challenges. And a lot of the cases, I think, of gun violence, if we were giving people live options for their lives that would be better, that would enable them to flourish, help them walk through their difficulties, we could reduce it in that way. So those are some initial thoughts I have, but it's a really good question. It's one we have to think about a lot more deeply because too many churches in America aren't really grappling with it much, if at all.
Rob, I'm sorry, Mike.
No, jump in.
Not that I don't want to talk to you too, Rob, but you talk about this some in your book, but there's one of the questions to me is the fear issue. There's a lot of fear in our culture, and our politicians from time to time, well, more than time to time, use fear as a way, and always have historically, as a way of motivating the country to do certain things, right? And I know that a lot of gun ownership or self-protection drive has been around this sense that the world is a much more dangerous place than it used to be, that it's a much more violent place than it used to be, and that I have to be able to protect my family. I remember that when Obama was first elected, the number of gun purchases went up astronomically in the country, which I can't help but think has some racial overtones to it, which is a whole different topic, but equally as tragic. But in your book, you say that violence and violent crime and suicide are not on the rise in America. Talk about that a little bit, and this notion, this fear that exists in our culture, and how does that contribute to this?
Yeah, I think that is one of the myths, that, violence is on the rise. But then when you actually look, it's since the early 90s, violent crime in general, the trend is downward since then. So the world's not coming apart at the seams, even though people might think it or feel it. I've heard people say that to me, and someone told me we're going to have to become our own militia to protect myself and my family, but that doesn't line up with reality. That is a myth. In fact, people that are motivated to buy a gun out of fear, or just purely because they think their lives are at risk or self-defense, generally speaking, if you own a gun, statistically, it's you or somebody in your home are the ones who have a chance of getting shot, much more than a home invader or a criminal or something like that. So the statistics show that if you have a gun in the home, it's going to be someone who's a member of that household who will actually get shot or killed, not, someone who's breaking in your house in the middle of the night. So yeah, that's important. Now, part of that has to do with people not having any training and not knowing what they're doing. But I think it's important for people to see that, because if I'm afraid I'm going to buy a gun, now I'm safe, you've actually created more danger in your home than there was before you had the gun in it.
And I think one of the topics of conversation for Christian communities should be to talk about the fear.
Yeah.
Right? The fear that undergirds so much of the messages we receive, right? And how we as Christians, I think it's said more in the New Testament than any other thing, just about, is do not be afraid, right? Mm-hmm. And yet we live in constant fear. So
yeah, and that gets fed. A lot of the sort of more conservative, or even a lot of the rhetoric from the NRA and from politicians, right, talks about, they paint this picture of just things are falling apart, and right, that if you don't have a gun, you're going to get, you or your family will be killed. And sometimes you're right. Sometimes there's a racial, I was going to say undertone, but it's not even an undertone. Sometimes it's explicit. That's part of it. Look, human psychology, if we're afraid, we're much more likely to act on that fear, given the way we are. So it's effective, but it's not grounded in reality. And so as a Christian community, we want to have sound minds. We want to live lives of wisdom and help others do the same. And so the facts matter.
Well, Mike, you're a moral.
Go ahead, Rob.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you, Dr. Hamlin. Thank you. Mike, you're a moral philosopher. You lecture on ethics, but I also know that you have a very active life in the church, and that you're very engaged in your own local church. When we talk about Christian formation, you were talking about churches taking this on as a subject. And if we talk about the way Christians are formed within the church, it raises all kinds of questions. And for me, one of those moral questions is it always the right thing and the moral thing that I survive a violent confrontation? In other words, am I more or less obligated to carry a weapon because it is always God's will, it's always the right thing, it's always the moral outcome that I survive in a violent confrontation? Is there room for that question?
Yeah, I think that's
an equation, at least.
Yeah, I think so. For me, I think actually the default Christian position would be one of, I don't know how to say it, of vulnerability, of willingness to lay your life down. So if we read the Sermon on the Mount, it paints a picture of what life sort of as a follower of Christ, that's the picture that we're trying to, and it's not just supposed to, as some said in the 1900s, well, that's just for that's sort of after the afterlife or later, it's never going to happen now. But it seems pretty clear to me that that's the vision that we should have as a Christian faith community. So for me, that's my conviction. I would never carry a fire. Well, actually, I don't carry one with me, and I wouldn't carry one into church. I think Christians have to come to grips with the fact that our faith teaches us that our life is not our own, that laying down our lives for others, can be God's will for us, to put it bluntly. And so it's not an absolute obligation to always protect my own life, or even necessarily the lives of other people, right? That's where we need wisdom. We need the help of our community. I would say help of the Spirit of God to give us insight. But yeah, it's a hard question, and it's easy to say, but my hope is that if I was ever in that situation, I would be willing to do that. And of course, we never know till we're in it. But for me, for one, I refuse to be armed going into church, or to carry a gun with me. I think it changes your perspective on a lot of things. And for me, I wouldn't want to do that.
I thank you for that. As we move along, even with our time, I feel like our dean right now, I've got a long list of just personal questions that I can ask you, but time is moving along, and we've given opportunity for some of our listeners and those who have connected with us to ask questions. And so I'd like to bring at least some of their voices into this at this moment with the time that we have left. And believe me, the questions are piling up as we're sitting here coming in, because it's such an interesting conversation. While I have so many, there was one that came in that was really for all of us, which I thought was very interesting, of how would we respond to simply the commandment that says, thou shalt not kill, in this whole discussion of gun ownership and whether it be the different perspectives that would be. And so I really put that out for all of us, if we were talking to those that are listening, because someone adamantly wanted to ask that question. I've got, like I said, plenty more, but I'd like to really ask that of everyone. It comes up in this debate.
Yeah, I guess I'll start, and then those of you who know more about these things, which would be all three of you, I think, can say more. But at least some people they'll go back and say the word for thou shalt not kill actually means murder. And so then that opens the door for self-defense or defense of others. But again, from the peace building view I'm trying to create and advocate in the book and advocate in real life, it's still, that doesn't just mean, it doesn't just open the door, right? It means it cracks it very slightly. And the presumption should still be nonviolent, because from a Christian faith perspective, every single human being bears God's image. And so I think anyone being killed or dying or murdered in self-defense killed in self-defense or murdered, it's incredibly tragic. So I think that's an important point to bring out, but maybe others have some different things to weigh in with.
Well, the only thing I would add to that, and I should say that 20 years ago, I published a book making precisely that argument, Mike, that you just alluded to, that the word for kill here, tirtzach in Hebrew, was restricted to murder outside of law. I don't believe that anymore. In fact, there's a lot of scholarship to challenge that. So I want to be on the record with that. That's not the way I view it now. But I think killing within a Christian context in particular has different questions that attach to it. Again, what is the will of God in the instant, in the moment? But balancing that out, there's also the issue of human instinct for survival. And let's imagine a violent confrontation, and we see only one path, as you said earlier, there might be justification for use of a firearm and violence to either defend my own life or the life of another. But I'm not sure, and I get some of this inspiration from the guy over my shoulder, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who faced these questions and addresses them in his magnum opus, Ethics, which I highly recommend everyone read after they read your book. He deals with these questions that in an extreme moment may not have a clear path, but in the end are not to be justified, simply lamented. So if an act of killing is seen as the only path to protecting another human life or survival of some sort, then I see the response not as justification for it, but simply lamentation. It's a tragedy, a sad failure. So I think sometimes we get into an equation where we think we have to justify everything, particularly as Christians. Somehow find the will of God in that thing. It's not necessarily the case. So killing can simply be a tragic and lamentable act that should not be repeated. That's how I see it.
Well, we'll get together. I'd like to look at some of the scholarship you referenced, because that's one thing I definitely didn't go into as much depth, but yeah, that's important. And I think it speaks to the question. That's an important thing to bring out.
I want us to go on to some other questions to get some other folks in here, but I would just agree with Rob. I think this issue, that very issue, hinges also on the legal moral question, right? That, you know, we can talk about legal justification for defense of oneself or defense of one's family or something like that, but then the fact that taking another human life is always a tragedy and always the result of human sin. Maybe not on the part of the person who has to defend family or whatever, but the result of sin in the world, our brokenness with one another. And so always a failure to honor our God.
Yeah, I very much appreciate all of the answers and responses when the questions like these come up, because not that it may at times be complicated, but they certainly, even in the answers, they give a great witness of how complex all of the factors are in addressing these issues, or someone making a decision that they really need to make in life. With many of these questions, Mike, we had one that wanted to ask, do you address the issue of race and guns in America, especially when it comes to castle doctrine or stand your ground laws?
Yes, I do. And this is one of the things that, yeah, that's really troubling. And of course it speaks to our time when some people are denying there's such a thing as systemic racism. The stand your ground laws is a perfect tragic example of that. I was looking this over earlier. You know, the stand your ground laws, sometimes it's almost, if you feel threatened, you're justified. Other states, it's reasonably perceive someone as a threat. The problem is, well, I'll quote here. This is from a book I make use of in mine on stand your ground laws, Carolyn Light. She says this: a common thread of these cases, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, we can add others, is that our legal structures and agents deemed it reasonable to perceive unarmed Black people as threatening, right? And so another piece of information, that in states where there are these stand your ground laws, whites who kill Blacks are 11 times more likely to be found innocent of a crime in states with those laws than Blacks who kill whites. So there's definitely a racial component to those laws, and it's tragic. And you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates mentions this, that the way they're set up is, if there's some sort of dispute about whether someone was really, their life was at risk, well, it creates an advantage, the person who has a gun and uses it, because then the other person's voice is gone because they're gone. And so there's a racial element, and then it also sort of gives you an extra motive to be violent, right? It almost feeds into violence. So I'm really concerned about those for both of those reasons.
No, thank you. We have a question, and really this is for everyone. They were asking, how might anyone here suggest speaking to family and friends that are on the extremes of these issues? And could you give any recommendations for helping to have these conversations or finding compromise? And they wanted to ask this really of everyone.
Great question.
Yeah. I'll quickly, I'm a philosophy professor, so I have a tendency to not be quick, but I can do it. On one extreme, I think you just start asking, so someone who says there should be no restrictions, see how far they're willing to go. So do they think you should allow fully automatic weapons? Should you allow RPGs? Should you allow someone to have a tank, a nuclear? I mean, keep going to nuclear weapons. Sooner or later, most people, there is going to be a line. And then you have some common ground. Well, if that's the reason you don't think people should have a tank, can you see how some of that same reasoning might lead someone to think you shouldn't have a fully automatic weapon or certain kinds of semi-automatic weapons? So that might be one way to go. On the other side, I think people who want to repeal the Second Amendment and who maybe think of all gun owners as, as we talked about earlier, like in really negative terms, to realize that that's a caricature just as much as it is the other way. So trying to see that there are people who are responsible gun owners who aren't out to get everybody else or motivated purely by fear. So trying to bring people out of those extremes and get some common ground to discuss.
I think it's a very difficult issue, and I think it's an issue that we have to deal with on a lot of levels, whether it's the gun question, whether it's I know a number of families who are divided politically now, deeply divided and have a hard time having conversations with each other. I think first and foremost, I think you raised some really good points, Mike, but it comes down to, if you want to make some progress with someone that you care about, who's on a different extreme than you are, the first thing you have to do is to really be willing to listen to them, to sit and honor them as this person you value, and listen to them without creating in your mind your next response to the thing you think is wrong that they just said, but just to genuinely listen to them, and then to let them genuinely listen to you, and to do that back and forth. I think we tend not to listen to one another. We tend to only hear what we need to hear to create our next argument oftentimes. And I think that's on a whole different, on lots of subjects. I think that's a real reality these days.
Yeah, my 2 cents on that is just, and it's really complements what Dean Hollerith just said, that we have to suspend our presumption of ill intent on the part of our conversation partner. So we have a way, and I hear this from my friends who are avid, gun owners and Second Amendment rights defenders, who will presume that the other side wants to do nothing but take away something from them that's very important to them. And the other way around, those, who are advocates of regulation often assume that gun owners want only to harm and injure people. And I think we need to exercise a certain discipline in suspending those presumptions when we're in conversation. But the other thing I would recommend is a very practical one, that you find an excuse to give your family member, friend, colleague, a copy of Mike's book as a gift, and say,
I like that.
This is a gift for you. You may love it or you may hate it. But regardless of how you see it, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Let it be a conversation starter.
That's very good. Being able to get the conversation started with so many different materials and us putting information in front of everyone. Again, I think just having this conversation is helpful to many because we're having the conversation. And so I'm grateful for that. When we look at the difference, and we raised it just a little about the difference between areas of the country. And when we talk about concentrated areas, when we look at those numbers, as we said, of violence going down, often we have concentrated areas where those numbers are on the rise. When we go to cities, how do we really address the issue that you raised in that. When in some areas we see the numbers on very broadly going down, but as was raised, the fear of raising children, just coming out the door, the innocents that are being shot, how would you address that particular argument when everyone says the numbers are going down and we're in a good place?
Yeah, and so that's an important point, because some places, yeah, like you said, it is on the rise, it is high, it is concentrated. I would say the answer to that is not, the best answer is not being more armed, because I think we aspire to something. I mean, look, as in the American democracy, we aspire to something better than that there's violence here, so I'm not safe, so I'm going to be armed to protect myself. And if somebody makes that decision and they thought through it, they're cautious and trained, then I can understand that. But then I think we have to step back and say, but why should we accept the status quo? Why can't we do something? Why can't we make things better so that that city is safe, or that block is as safe as the next block, right? And it just doesn't, we don't just have to, like, it just breaks my heart that, and you're not saying this, but I think so many times we just think, well, that's just the way it is. But we can make it better, right? People's basic needs can be met. We can make the socioeconomic floor of our society, we can raise it so that people don't have to live in fear of gun violence for themselves or their children, so much so that they're maybe even moved to arm themselves. So that's what I would say. And of course, that's an easy thing to say, harder to do, but we're not going to get there until we start taking steps towards it. And many people are. I just want more of us to do more of that.
Leonard, let's do pick your best question. I know you got 24 of them there that are great, and we'll wrap it up with this last one. Give Mike the last word.
Well, I don't know about the best question. I got into trouble a lot of times in school when that got asked.
Yeah, that's unfair, I guess.
But let me ask this. Certainly, we've talked about a little bit about that fine line between moral and legal. And, in many faiths, I know as I was growing up, we always talked about we'll understand it better by and by. And of course, growing in our understanding. But in asking the question of the role that we have, once again, do you believe that we as a faith community can truly, as many are putting sort of in their general questions, make a difference with where we are right now with so much division by making a moral argument?
That's a good question. Whether or not we can be effective, this springs from for faith communities, that first question is, but we can be faithful, right? We can be faithful to do it regardless. And I guess I would say this, the effectiveness, one thing that hasn't come up here in this discussion is that over half of the deaths by gun violence are suicide, or by suicide. So there's a lot we can do right away to reduce that the church can do to make resources available, to train people to spot someone who's contemplating it, to not allow easy access to people who maybe a teenager who's struggling with those kind of thoughts. So don't want to get too far off, but that's what I would say. We've got to, the prophets weren't always effective from a certain perspective in the Old Testament, but they still cried out for justice. So we want to do the same thing for justice, mercy, peace, those kind of things.
Thank you, Mike. So folks, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I want to thank Mike for coming in and being willing to talk about his book, and for the incredible work being done by the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute and Rob Schenck, and for my colleague, Leonard Hamlin. I'm so glad to be with all of you. And I hope you will purchase Mike's book and give it a read. I have a degree in philosophy, and so many philosophy books that you pick up are tough. They're tough to read. And I think Mike does a really good job of making some complex ideas very accessible. And I think it's a book that's really, really useful and right on target for the times in which we live. So my thanks to all of you for taking part in the conversation, and for Margaret and the team at the Cathedral who make all these happen behind the scenes. God bless you guys. Thank you for that work. And my many blessings to all of you out there tonight. Thank you for being with us. God bless you and keep you.